Hello again. This time I thought I would address a fairly, for me at least, interesting question, or for some in the field at least interesting question, which is the statement, what is literature? This is the question that's been asked of me quite a bit. That's one I ask of my students on a regular basis. It's one that's been somewhat debated in the field. Personally, I've been considering it for over 25-ish years and still don't really have a solid answer. However, I figured I'd present a few perspectives and possibilities. On one level, we can have literature could be a qualitative judgment. This is probably at its most narrow in terms of defining the concept. This, unfortunately, because of being qualitative judgment, may not be clearly defined. A reference to a judge who, I believe it was in regards to James Joyce's Ulysses, stated that he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it. And much the same way, when we have qualitative judgments for literature or defining literature, we'd say, well, we can't really define it exactly, but we know it when we see it. However, qualitative judgments change as society does. Shakespeare's a good example here. Back in the Renaissance, he was considered a high-end playwright. During the Restoration period, he was considered a third rate, that people didn't really want to see his plays. They modified them. They gave all of his tragedies different endings. They gave some of the comedies different endings. They completely messed around with all of the plays. But people didn't generally go see his work as much. He was sort of the 3 blocks off Broadway sort of thing. Today, on the other hand, of course, Shakespeare is considered a great playwright, potentially one of the best in history and whatnot. So the qualitative judgments, I personally don't work for me because they are too changeable in terms of structure. Things that were considered good writing back in, say, the we'll say Victorian or Restoration eras are not considered good writing, today. For example, 17th, 18th century writers were very big on extremely long, convoluted sentences with lots of semicolons and commas and whatnot, and they seem to have an aversion to periods. Tolkien, on the other hand, early 20th century, was really big on extremely descriptive writing, where, as the joke goes, he spent 3 pages describing a tree. Slight exaggeration, but not too much. On the other hand, a lot of modern writing, modern fiction especially, coming out of various genres, follows the view of less is more, takes the route of, if it's not important doesn't move the plot forward or develop characters, then cut it. And that's just today's qualitative elements regarding writing, particularly fiction. So getting a little broader than the qualitative judgment, we can go with literature is fictional writing. So we could limit this to fiction, which would be sort of any fiction writing. That we could also further limit it by genre or age range or things like that. And in fact, often within the field, we will talk about different genre literature or different age range literature. For example, we talk about fantasy literature or detective literature or young adult literature or children's literature. Personally, I think fiction doesn't work as well as far as a definition, because we could have narratives that fall under literature or are literary narratives but are themselves nonfiction. For example, somebody's memoirs or travel narrative could be considered literature but is nonfiction or is mostly nonfiction. Obviously, most autobiographical materials and things do get fictionalized to some extent because people tend to write positively about themselves rather than negatively. They tend to downplay negative sides and upplay positive attributes, or spin memories in different ways and whatnot. But if we take this view as literature as being a sort of narrative, then literature is basically storytelling, coming out of a many thousand year, 30, 40, 50,000 year tradition of storytelling, possibly more. So it's fairly broad in that kind of defining. Another, or perhaps the broadest of definitions, is that all written works count as literature. Because storytelling takes many forms. It can go anywhere from directions or flows of users along websites. When we say, is that literature? Well, many people will say no, some will say yes. But by the broadest definition, literature would be anything that's any written work. The problem that comes up with this is that it's kind of to a point of being a useless definition. If the definition revolves to everything, then what's the good or what's the point of the definition? So I think we have to consider all elements in some regard. We want to consider genre potentially, we want to consider age range, we want to consider and other factors as different types of literatures. And there may be a qualitative judgment in there. That certainly comes into play to some degree, because there are certainly definable differences between various authors and writing abilities and whatnot. That said, this is a tough, possibly impossible question or definition to pin down, as is true with pretty much any art. We look at a painting, we look at sculptures, and we say, is this art, is this not art? Various narrow and broad definitions. We're still making qualitative judgments and other assessments coming into play there. As noted, as I said earlier, I spent over 2 decades considering this question, 3 literature degrees, and some days I think it's an unnecessary question, something that is never answerable in many regards, or at least not in any kind of satisfying or effective way. Because any definition we have in there leaves out things that can fall within it or should fall within it, we'll put it that way, but also may include things that shouldn't be in there by other definitions. And a fair bit of it is subjective to some degree. But other days, I think we should be able to define a difference between, say, E.L. James, which I would stridently argue is not literature, and Frank Herbert, who I would stridently argue is literature. Something definite, something definitive, something stronger that goes beyond Stephen King's relatively famous quip about his own work being the literary equivalent of a Big Mac. On the other hand, we can argue that this is almost a sort of philosophical question that may or may not have an answer, but is there for us to think about, consider, approach, mull over, work with, without ever coming to a conclusive, defined, final result. There are some questions out there that are not intended to be answered. The question is intended for us to think about things. This is where I would say it's a philosophical question. In that many cases in philosophical questions, we're not intended to find a definitive answer to the question. What we're intended to do, or what we should be doing, is thinking about, mulling over, considering various possibilities and directions, and perhaps arguing for one or more, depending on the situation, using different reasoning techniques. And that can be a way to explore our own biases, our own takes, our own thoughts and ideas. And a lot of those questions are things that we should revisit, which is part of why I do revisit this question and ask my students to revisit this question on a fairly regular basis, because I don't know that we'll ever come to a definitive answer. But the process of asking ourselves this question gets us thinking. It gets us considering what we expect and what biases or inherent preconceptions we have, and what expectations we have. And that's an important part of both growth as individuals, as societies, and in the critical thinking, critical reading areas and arenas. And that's part of, I think, why this question is a good one to continue to look at and come back to. So I know it didn't really answer any questions, and but maybe it provides something to kind of think about and consider there. Personally, a lot of what I work with, a lot of what I have worked with for a long time has been pop culture related works, whether they be genre fiction, mostly genre fiction, whether they be alternate histories or fantasies or urban fantasies or young adult literature and whatnot. And yes, I would consider a lot of these literature. There are other people in my field who say, no, that stuff's not literature. It's pop culture, therefore it can't be literature. To that, I respond that there was a time when Geoffrey Chaucer, considered one of the greatest the first English author, or first modern/Middle English author, a great author, and Shakespeare, considered currently one of the great playwrights in history, that both of them were pop culture. Shakespeare was essentially the, we'll say, Sapkowski or the George Martin or the Joe Rowling, if you will, or the Stephen King of the 16th, 17th, early 17th centuries. He was popular fiction. He was writing for not just the highbrow audience, but also for the common, what they called groundlings. He was pop culture for his day. Chaucer was pop culture for his day in the 14th century. Today, they are considered great high literature. So that gets into the qualitative judgment side of things. Unfortunately, people have kind of forgotten that these individuals some of these individuals we consider high literature today were pop culture for their era. So I'll leave you with that thought and make what you will of it.